Senior Chief Petty Officer David Rodriguez had led 43 successful missions in Afghanistan without losing a single man under his command, earning a reputation as one of the Navy's most skilled and careful team leaders. But on March 22, in a remote valley outside Kandahar, bad intelligence and his split-second decision to trust it had cost him everything that mattered. His 6-man SEAL team lay dead in a Taliban ambush while he survived with nothing but minor shrapnel wounds and the crushing weight of responsibility for their deaths. For 8 months, David had been asking himself the same impossible question that tormented him through sleepless nights and waking nightmares, until the day he found himself face to face with Jonathan Roumie and finally spoke the words that had been destroying him from the inside. Why did God save me and let them die? I was their leader. I led them into that kill zone. So why am I the one who gets to go home to his family? The meeting had been arranged through the Gary Sinise Foundation, an organization that connected wounded warriors and military families with resources for healing and support. Jonathan had been participating in their Wounded Warrior events for several months, using his platform as the actor who portrayed Jesus to minister to service members struggling with physical and emotional trauma. The foundation's organizers had specifically requested that Jonathan meet with David, describing him as a decorated SEAL team leader who was experiencing severe survivor guilt after losing his entire team in combat. David had initially resisted the meeting, convinced that his situation was beyond the reach of traditional counseling, religious comfort, or celebrity motivation. He had already endured months of mandatory psychological evaluation, grief counseling, and well-meaning attempts from chaplains to help him process his trauma. Nothing had touched the fundamental question that consumed him. Why had he survived when 6 better men had died because of his leadership decisions? Meeting with an actor who played Jesus seemed like another empty gesture, another attempt to provide comfort where no comfort was possible. But as the 8-month anniversary of the ambush approached, and David's symptoms of PTSD and survivor guilt continued to worsen, his wife Maria had pleaded with him to try one more approach. She had been watching him deteriorate day by day, seeing the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the way he checked and rechecked locks on doors and windows, the way he would sit in their garage for hours staring at photos of his dead teammates while wrestling with thoughts of joining them. The foundation had arranged for the meeting to take place at a private retreat center in the mountains outside Colorado Springs, away from media attention and military protocol. David arrived wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and the kind of hypervigilant posture that marked him as someone whose nervous system remained locked in combat mode months after returning home. Jonathan was already waiting in the comfortable sitting room, dressed casually and reading what appeared to be a worn copy of Scripture. David Rodriguez had joined the Navy at 18, with dreams of serving his country in the most elite capacity possible. The path to becoming a Navy SEAL had been brutal, months of training that eliminated 90% of candidates, designed to identify men who could maintain performance under impossible conditions while never leaving a teammate behind. David had not only survived the training, he had excelled, demonstrating the kind of natural leadership and tactical intelligence that marked future team leaders. Over 12 years of active service, David had deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and other classified locations where America's most dangerous missions required the skills of its most elite warriors. He had led teams through urban warfare, mountain operations, desert reconnaissance, and hostage rescue missions. His record was flawless, 43 missions completed successfully. Every man under his command returned home alive and uninjured. David's reputation within the SEAL community was legendary. Other team leaders sought his advice on tactical planning. Junior SEALs requested assignment to his team, knowing that serving under Rodriguez meant learning from one of the best while maintaining the highest probability of survival. Command structure trusted him with the most sensitive missions, confident that his combination of tactical expertise and protective leadership would achieve objectives while minimizing casualties. The 6 men who died under David's command in Afghanistan had been more than teammates. They had been brothers forged through shared experiences that civilian life could never replicate. Petty Officer First Class Miguel Santos, 32, married with twin daughters, had served alongside David for 4 years and saved his life twice in previous engagements. Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Mitchell, 28, had been the team's medic and unofficial comedian, keeping morale high during the most stressful operations. Petty Officer Second Class Alex Johnson, 25, had been the youngest member of the team but had proven himself in countless firefights with courage that impressed even veteran operators. Petty Officer Second Class Tony Ricci, 30, had been David's communications specialist and closest friend on the team, someone whose tactical radio work had extracted them from impossible situations on multiple occasions. Petty Officer Third Class Brad Williams, 24, had been the team's explosive ordnance expert, capable of disarming improvised explosive devices while under fire. Petty Officer Third Class Chris Thompson, 26, had been the team's sniper whose precision shooting had saved American lives in dozens of operations. These were not just statistics or names on a casualty report. They were David's responsibility, his brothers, men whose wives and children he knew personally, whose fears and hopes he had shared through long nights in forward operating bases across multiple deployments. The weight of their deaths pressed against David's chest like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to sleep, and unbearable to imagine a future where their absence made sense. Operation Red Dawn had been classified as a routine reconnaissance mission, the kind of assignment David's team had completed dozens of times successfully. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was using a compound in a remote valley as a staging area for attacks on coalition forces. David's team was tasked with conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence on the compound's layout and security measures, and identifying the best approach for a future capture or elimination mission. The intelligence package provided by command had seemed thorough and reliable. Satellite imagery showed the compound's structure, estimated enemy presence at fewer than 8 combatants, and suggested multiple egress routes that would allow the team to extract safely after completing their reconnaissance. Weather conditions were favorable, moon illumination was minimal, and local coalition forces were positioned to provide support if needed. David had spent hours studying the intelligence, conducting mission planning with his team, and identifying contingencies for various scenarios they might encounter. His standard operating procedure included multiple backup plans, communication protocols with command, and predetermined rally points in case the team became separated. Every member of his team understood their role, their sectors of responsibility, and the signals that would indicate immediate extraction was necessary. The insertion had gone smoothly, with the team infiltrating the valley under cover of darkness and establishing an observation post that provided clear sight lines to the target compound. For the first 4 hours, everything proceeded according to plan. They documented personnel movements, structural details, and patterns of activity that would inform future operations. David felt the familiar satisfaction that came from watching his team execute a complex mission with perfect precision and coordination. But the intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. What command had described as a small Taliban staging area was actually a major insurgent stronghold, housing more than 40 experienced fighters who had been expecting American Special Operations Forces and had prepared accordingly. The surveillance mission was not gathering intelligence on an unsuspecting enemy. It was walking directly into a carefully orchestrated trap that would turn David's observation post into a kill zone. The first indication that something was wrong came at 0347 hours, when Tony Ricci's voice crackled through David's headset, with words that would replay in his nightmares for months afterward. Movement on all sides. We're surrounded. Within seconds, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions around the team's observation post, creating a crossfire pattern that demonstrated sophisticated tactical planning and intimate knowledge of American Special Operations procedures. David's training kicked in immediately, his mind shifting into the hyper-vigilant combat mode that had kept him alive through dozens of firefights. He began issuing orders to his team, coordinating their defensive positions while simultaneously calling for extraction support and trying to identify escape routes that might allow them to break contact with the enemy. But even as his tactical mind processed options and contingencies, a deeper part of his consciousness was already recognizing the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in terrain that provided minimal cover against an enemy that had chosen the time and place of engagement. The firefight lasted 47 minutes, though David would later struggle to reconstruct the exact sequence of events. Combat situations compress time in ways that make precise memory difficult, but certain images remained burned into his consciousness with painful clarity. Miguel Santos crying out when a bullet shattered his femur, still trying to return fire while blood soaked through his uniform. James Mitchell crawling through enemy fire to reach wounded teammates, providing medical aid while bullets struck the ground around him. Alex Johnson's last radio transmission, reporting enemy positions even as his own position became untenable. One by one, David watched his teammates fall. Tony Ricci died trying to establish communication with extraction helicopters. Brad Williams was killed attempting to clear a path through enemy positions with explosive charges. Chris Thompson provided covering fire until a sniper's bullet ended his resistance. Each death felt like a personal failure, evidence that David's leadership and tactical decisions were inadequate for the situation they faced. When the extraction helicopters finally arrived, drawn by the sustained gunfire and desperate radio calls for support, they found David unconscious from blood loss but alive, surrounded by the bodies of 6 men who had trusted his leadership and paid for that trust with their lives. The minor shrapnel wounds that had caused his blood loss were superficial compared to the damage his teammates had sustained, adding to the sense that survival had been random rather than earned. The military investigation that followed concluded that David had performed his duties according to standard operating procedures, and that the mission failure was due to faulty intelligence rather than tactical errors by the team leader. His superiors praised his heroic efforts to save his teammates under impossible conditions and recommended him for a Bronze Star Medal for his actions during the firefight. From the Navy's perspective, David was a hero who had done everything possible to protect his men under circumstances beyond his control. But David experienced the investigation's conclusions as hollow vindication that failed to address the fundamental questions tormenting him. Why had his split-second decisions during the firefight been insufficient to save his men? Why had minor wounds left him functional, while more capable operators had died around him? Why had he been the one to survive when any of his teammates would have been better choices for sparing from death? The mandatory counseling sessions that followed his return to the United States felt like administrative requirements rather than genuine efforts to help him process his trauma. Military psychologists explained survivor guilt as a normal response to combat trauma, assured him that his feelings of responsibility were disproportionate to his actual culpability, and prescribed medications designed to reduce anxiety and improve sleep. But none of these interventions touched the spiritual dimensions of his struggle with questions about divine justice, purpose, and the meaning of survival when better men had died. David's wife Maria watched helplessly as the man she had married gradually disappeared, replaced by someone who, startled at sudden noises, checked locks compulsively and spent hours sitting alone in their garage, staring at photographs of his dead teammates. He stopped attending church, claiming that he couldn't reconcile his faith in a loving God with the reality of watching good men die while he lived. He avoided social gatherings with other military families, unable to bear the well-meaning condolences and awkward conversations about his experience. Sleep became elusive, as David's nights filled with vivid dreams that replayed the ambush with different outcomes, scenarios where his tactical decisions saved his teammates, where he died instead of them, where divine intervention prevented the tragedy altogether. He would wake exhausted and disoriented, struggling to distinguish between memory and imagination, between what had actually happened and what his guilt-ridden subconscious wished had occurred instead. David's relationship with God had been foundational to his identity as both a warrior and a husband. He had grown up in a devout Catholic family where faith informed every aspect of daily life and provided meaning for both blessing and suffering. His military service had been understood as a form of ministry, protecting innocent people and defending righteous causes through the application of necessary force. Prayer had been as much a part of his pre-mission routine as weapons checks and tactical planning. But the deaths of his teammates had shattered David's theological framework in ways that traditional religious counseling seemed unable to address. If God protected righteous men doing necessary work, why had his most faithful and capable teammates died while he survived? If divine providence guided the outcome of human conflicts, why had his prayers for their safety been answered with their deaths? If faith and service earned divine protection, what had he done wrong to deserve survival while better men died? The chaplain at David's home base had attempted to provide theological comfort through explanations about God's mysterious plan, the eternal perspective that made earthly suffering temporary, and the assurance that his teammates were in a better place. But these explanations felt like betrayals of both his dead brothers and his own experience of their loss. They had not wanted to die in an Afghan valley. They had wanted to complete their mission and return home to wives and children who were now left to grieve without understanding why their sacrifice had been necessary. David's anger toward God was complicated by his continued need for divine intervention in processing his trauma. He could not pray in the ways he had before the ambush, but he also could not stop himself from crying out to God in moments of desperation and rage. His faith had not disappeared so much as it had become a source of additional torment, another aspect of his identity that the ambush had damaged beyond conventional repair. When Maria suggested that he meet with Jonathan Roumie, David's initial response was skeptical, bordering on hostile. What could an actor possibly understand about the realities of combat leadership, the weight of decisions that cost lives, or the spiritual struggle of surviving when better men died? Meeting with someone who portrayed Jesus for entertainment seemed like a trivialization of his genuine theological crisis, another well-meaning gesture that would fail to address the depth of his spiritual wounds. The retreat center, where David met Jonathan, was designed to provide peaceful surroundings for healing and reflection, with large windows overlooking mountain vistas and comfortable seating arranged to encourage intimate conversation. David arrived early and spent several minutes studying the serene environment, wondering if such surroundings could possibly contain the rage and desperation he had been carrying for 8 months. Jonathan entered the room quietly, introducing himself with the kind of genuine warmth that immediately distinguished him from the military personnel and counselors who had attempted to help David process his trauma. There was something in Jonathan's demeanor that suggested he understood the difference between offering comfort and offering presence, between trying to fix someone's pain and simply witnessing it with compassion. They began with small talk about David's family, his military service, and his experience with the chosen episodes that Maria had convinced him to watch during his recovery. Jonathan asked thoughtful questions about military culture and the bonds between service members, demonstrating genuine curiosity about David's world rather than superficial familiarity with military life gleaned from movies or television shows. But David had not traveled to Colorado for pleasant conversation, and after 20 minutes of polite exchange, he interrupted Jonathan's questions with the directness that characterized his military communication style. "I need to ask you something," David said, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone who had been holding back emotional pressure for too long. "And I need you to answer me as someone who has spent years thinking about what Jesus would actually say, not as an actor giving me lines from a script." Jonathan nodded, his expression shifting to reflect the seriousness of David's tone. "What do you need to know?" David leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly, as if he were trying to maintain physical control over the emotional force of his question. "I was responsible for 6 men. 6 of the best warriors this country ever produced. 6 husbands and fathers who trusted me to bring them home alive. I made tactical decisions that led them into an ambush where they died while I survived with nothing but scratches." His voice began to crack slightly, but he pressed on with military determination. "For 8 months, everyone has been telling me it wasn't my fault, that I did everything right, that their deaths were unavoidable. But that doesn't answer the question that's destroying me from the inside." David looked directly into Jonathan's eyes with the intensity of someone asking a question upon which his entire future depended. Why did God save me and let them die? I was their leader. I led them into that kill zone. So why am I the one who gets to go home to his family? Why am I sitting here talking to you while 6 better men are dead because I trusted bad intelligence and made wrong decisions? The silence that followed David's question seemed to stretch forever, filled with the weight of 8 months of torment and the desperate need for an answer that could provide meaning to senseless loss. Jonathan's face showed that he understood the magnitude of what David was asking, not just a theological question about divine justice, but a personal plea for understanding that would determine whether David could find a way to live with his survival. When Jonathan finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone who had spent years wrestling with the hardest questions about faith and suffering. David, he began, I want you to know that I'm not going to try to explain away your teammates' deaths or minimize your struggle with why you survived. What happened to you and your team was a tragedy that shouldn't have happened, and no theological explanation is going to make that loss acceptable or easy to understand. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. But I can tell you what I think Jesus would say about the question that's been tormenting you, based on everything I've learned about his character through years of studying his response to human suffering. David leaned forward, desperate for any perspective that might provide relief from the spiritual agony that had been consuming him. I don't think Jesus would tell you that God chose to save you instead of them, Jonathan said carefully. I think he would tell you that sometimes terrible things happen in a world that's broken in ways we can't fully understand, and that survival or death in those situations isn't a reflection of divine preference or human worthiness. Jonathan moved to the edge of his chair, speaking directly to David with gentle intensity. But I think Jesus would also tell you that the fact you survived doesn't diminish their sacrifice or make their deaths meaningless. And I think he would tell you that your survival might not be random chance, it might be responsibility. David's expression showed confusion mixed with desperate attention. I mean that maybe you're still here, not because you deserve to live more than they deserve to, but because there are things only you can do with the time you've been given. Jonathan replied, maybe your survival is not a reward or a punishment, but a calling to honor their sacrifice by living in ways that give meaning to their deaths. David's composure, which he had maintained through months of counseling and evaluation, finally cracked under the weight of Jonathan's words. Tears began to stream down his face as 8 months of suppressed grief poured out in gasps and sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. But I can't honor them, David said through his tears. I can't even function properly. I can't sleep. I can't pray. I can't be the husband Maria deserves or the father my kids need. How can I honor 6 heroes when I can't even figure out how to live with myself? Jonathan reached forward and placed his hand on David's shoulder, offering physical comfort to accompany his words. David, the fact that their deaths matter so much to you, that you're willing to torture yourself with responsibility rather than accept easy answers, that's exactly the kind of love and loyalty that would honor their memory. He waited for David's crying to subside before continuing. I think your teammates would be heartbroken to know that their brother is destroying himself with guilt over their deaths. I think they would want you to grieve them, to remember them, to carry their memory forward, but not to sacrifice your own life and family on the altar of survivor guilt. David looked up, his face wet with tears but showing the first glimmer of hope Jonathan had seen since they began talking. But how do I live knowing they can't? How do I enjoy anything? Time with my family, simple pleasures, plans for the future, when they'll never have those opportunities again. By living fully enough for all of you, Jonathan replied, without hesitation. By being the kind of husband and father they would want to be if they could. By serving your family and community with the same dedication you brought to serving your country. By making sure their sacrifice contributed to something beautiful and meaningful rather than something broken and wasted. Something fundamental shifted in David's expression as Jonathan spoke. The rigid control that had held him together for 8 months began to relax, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Not the peace of having his questions fully answered, but the peace of finally having a framework for living with unanswered questions. "You're saying that honoring them doesn't mean destroying myself with guilt," David said slowly, as if testing the concept. "It means living well enough to justify their sacrifice." "Exactly," Jonathan confirmed. "I think Jesus would tell you that your teammates didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life in emotional prison. They died doing their job, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, serving something larger than their individual lives. The best way to honor that sacrifice is to live your life in service of something equally meaningful." David was quiet for a long time, processing this perspective that reframed his survival from inexplicable fortune to purposeful responsibility. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger than it had been all day. "I've been thinking about their deaths as something that happened to me, something I had to survive and cope with," he said. "But you're suggesting I should think about my survival as something that happened for them, something I can use to extend their impact beyond their deaths." Jonathan nodded. "What would Miguel Santos want you to do with the years he didn't get to have? What would James Mitchell hope you would accomplish with the time he lost? What would Tony Ricci expect from his team leader who made it home when he didn't?" The questions hit David with almost physical force, but instead of the crushing weight he had felt when contemplating his teammates' deaths, these questions carried something that felt like purpose and direction. "They would want me to be the best husband and father I could be," David said, his voice growing steadier. "They would want me to use my experience to help other warriors process their own trauma. They would want me to live in ways that proved their sacrifice made the world a better place." "Then that's how you honor them," Jonathan said simply. "Not by destroying yourself with guilt, but by building something beautiful with the life they helped preserve." The conversation continued for another hour, but the fundamental transformation had already occurred. David's questions became less desperate and more curious, as if he were a student trying to understand a new subject rather than a drowning man, grasping for salvation. He asked about practical steps for spiritual healing, about ways to process grief while maintaining hope, about how to rebuild a relationship with God that had been shattered by trauma. When they finally concluded their meeting, David thanked Jonathan with a sincerity that surprised both of them. As he prepared to return home to his family, David carried himself differently, not with the hyper-vigilant posture of someone expecting attack, but with the purposeful bearing of someone who had remembered his mission. The drive back to his hotel gave David time to process what had happened during his conversation with Jonathan. For the first time in 8 months, he found himself thinking about his teammates without the crushing weight of survivor guilt. Instead, he began to consider what each of them would want him to do with the life he had been given, how he might honor their memory through purposeful living rather than self-destructive mourning. That evening, David called Maria and had the first genuinely hopeful conversation they had shared since his return from Afghanistan. He described his meeting with Jonathan, his new understanding of survival as responsibility rather than random fortune, and his determination to live in ways that would make his teammates proud rather than heartbroken by his ongoing struggle. The ripple effect. David's transformation, following his meeting with Jonathan, created ripple effects that extended far beyond his immediate family. He began participating in veteran support groups, sharing his story and his new perspective on survivor guilt with other warriors struggling with similar trauma. His willingness to speak openly about his spiritual crisis and the framework for healing that Jonathan had provided became a source of hope for service members who had lost faith along with their brothers in arms. Within 6 months, David had become a sought-after speaker at military bases and veteran organizations, offering not easy answers about combat trauma, but honest testimony about the possibility of finding meaning in survival when others had died. His message resonated particularly strongly with other team leaders and commanders who carried responsibility for casualties under their command. David's relationship with his family began to heal as well. The hypervigilant father who had checked locks compulsively and startled at sudden sounds gradually gave way to someone who could be present with his children, engaged with his community, and supportive of his wife's own healing from the secondary trauma of watching her husband struggle with survivor guilt. Perhaps most significantly, David's relationship with God began to evolve from one of anger and confusion to one of complex but genuine faith. He began attending church again, not because his questions had been fully answered, but because he had learned to live faithfully in the midst of mystery and uncertainty. His prayers changed from desperate pleas for understanding to expressions of gratitude for the opportunity to honor his teammates through purposeful living. Jonathan's conversation with David also deepened his own understanding of his role as someone who portrayed Jesus for millions of viewers. The encounter reinforced his commitment to using his platform not just for entertainment, but for genuine ministry to people struggling with the hardest questions about faith, suffering, and the meaning of survival in a world marked by loss. 2 years after his meeting with Jonathan, David had established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting military families dealing with combat casualties and survivor trauma. The foundation provided counseling services, spiritual guidance, and practical support for service members struggling with questions about faith, purpose, and responsibility in the aftermath of losing teammates. David's approach to helping other veterans was informed by his own journey from destructive guilt to purposeful living. Rather than offering easy comfort or theological platitudes, he provided honest testimony about the possibility of finding meaning in survival while maintaining appropriate grief for those who had died. His story became a template for other survivors seeking to transform their trauma into sources of healing for others walking similar paths. The 6 men who died in that Afghan valley had achieved a different kind of immortality through David's ongoing work to honor their sacrifice. Miguel Santos' dedication to protecting his teammates lived on through David's mentorship of young service members. James Mitchell's commitment to healing found expression in David's support for wounded warriors and their families. Tony Ritchie's communication skills were reflected in David's ability to translate complex spiritual and emotional concepts into language that resonated with military audiences. Alex Johnson's courage inspired David's willingness to confront difficult questions about faith and trauma in public forums. Brad Williams' precision in handling dangerous situations informed David's careful approach to counseling veterans on the edge of crisis. Chris Thompson's protective instincts found new expression in David's work to prevent other military families from experiencing the kind of devastating loss his teammates' families had endured. David's story became a case study in military psychology programs, seminary courses on pastoral care for trauma survivors, and veteran support organizations across the country. Not because it provided easy answers about survivor guilt and spiritual crisis, but because it demonstrated the possibility of transforming trauma into purpose, of honoring the dead through passionate commitment to serving the living. The conversation between David and Jonathan was never recorded or broadcast, but its impact spread through military communities as other veterans shared David's story and sought similar encounters with spiritual mentors who could help them process their own struggles with faith and survival. Jonathan began receiving regular invitations to speak at military installations and veteran events, using his platform to facilitate conversations about the intersection of faith, service, and trauma recovery. The retreat center where David and Jonathan met became a regular venue for similar encounters, as other service members dealing with combat trauma sought spiritual guidance that could address both the practical and theological dimensions of their struggles. The facility's staff noted that conversations about survivor guilt, divine purpose, and the meaning of service had become common themes in their programs for military families. David's marriage to Maria not only survived his combat trauma, but became stronger through their shared commitment to supporting other military families dealing with similar challenges. Their children grew up understanding that their father's service had been transformed rather than ended by his combat experience, that his survival carried responsibilities that extended beyond his immediate family to include the broader community of warriors and their families. The question that had tormented David for 8 months, why God had saved him while allowing his teammates to die, never received a complete answer. But through his conversation with Jonathan and his subsequent journey toward healing, David discovered that some questions were more important for their asking than their answering. That wrestling with mystery could be a form of faith rather than evidence of its absence. His survival was not explained by his encounter with Jonathan, but it was transformed from a source of guilt into a source of purpose. The random nature of who lives and who dies in combat situations remained incomprehensible, but David learned to live productively with incomprehension rather than allowing it to destroy his capacity for meaning and connection. David's teammates had not died so that he could survive and do meaningful work. Their deaths remained senseless tragedies that should not have happened. But his survival could honor their sacrifice by ensuring that their commitment to service, protection, and brotherhood lived on through his ongoing work to support other warriors and their families. The God whom David had struggled to understand in the aftermath of the ambush remained mysterious in ways that his finite human mind could not fully grasp. But David learned to trust that mystery rather than demanding complete comprehension, to live faithfully in the midst of questions rather than requiring theological certainty as a prerequisite for spiritual engagement. In the end, David Rodriguez never fully understood why he survived while 6 better men died in an Afghan valley, but he learned to live with that question in ways that honored both his fallen teammates and the families they left behind, transforming his survival from inexplicable fortune into purposeful mission. The conversation that began with desperate questions about divine justice had evolved into a lifelong commitment to serving others who were struggling with similar questions, proving that healing could emerge from even the most devastating trauma when survival was understood as responsibility rather than reward. His story became a testament to the possibility that even the most senseless losses could be transformed into sources of meaning, that survivor guilt could evolve into survivor purpose, and that questions about divine justice could coexist with faithful living in service of something larger than individual understanding. The 6 men who died under his command had achieved a kind of resurrection through his ongoing work to honor their sacrifice, their commitment to service living on through his dedication to helping other warriors find their way home from the spiritual battlefields of trauma and loss.